So thank you for coming. What makes is this on at the moment? Okay. Uh, so what makes Quadi so interesting? Well, it was a pioneering project. Um, okay, that's good. And it's still relevant, and it goes right to fights. And, but let's talk about where we are. So, okay, good. Thank you. Do I turn this off, or are you going to switch? truly.
Oh, sorry, I'll just add that we will have question and answers, mingle with some coffee, tea, juice, and some treats, and book signing.
Yeah.
Have fun.
All right. So thank you for coming, and hopefully you'll find this an interesting subject. We're doing a hybrid thing on slide presentation, so hopefully I get my timing right because there's some dramatic moments, and I'll try to do that well. So I'm here to talk about the Quaddy Tidal Power Project, and just a question that had come up is, what's my background? Why am I interested? And the answer is that I created the Embassy Boating Guide series, which if you have a cruising boat and you want to go anywhere on the East Coast of the United States, from Eastport to Key West, Florida, you can go with one of my books. And in that process, I got interested in tides. And so I kept a folder that said tides on it. I just kept on throwing all the interesting stuff in there. One of them was the Quaddy Tidal Power Project. And so when I retired, I opened up that file and said, let's go up there and see what we find. And it turned out to be quite a story. So that's how I came to this. And Quaddy is really a fascinating story. And the thing that really is astonishing is that it was going to be two very important things. One is it was going to be the first commercial scale tide-powered hydroelectric power plant. There had been small scale tide mills all over the coast of Maine and the Maritimes, but this was going to be infinitely bigger, tens of thousands of times bigger. And to that second point, the Quaddy Tidal Power Project was going to be the world's largest power plant of any kind. And that's really astonishing. And when you put that novelty with that scale, you get a very controversial project from the moment it begins. Because anything that big will disrupt everything that already exists. So it was controversial. And there were a lot of different parts of that controversy, one of which was, could you do it? The second of, do we need it? And related to that was, could you do it in a cost-efficient way? Because you're talking about a massive project, and that's costly. So is it going to be worth it? And then another one that sounds like a very strange thing to be raising at this point of the conversation, but is this project capitalism or is it communism? Okay? So I'll introduce that now because your antenna will be up and you'll start to feel these things coming through. This was a really interesting project for me to work on because this was my COVID project. I went to a whole batch of archives all around the country, vacuumed up lots of information, and then COVID hit. And so I had 20,000 pages of documents to read. And as I was reading all of this material, both government reports, private letters, engineering studies, and slews of newspaper articles, I had this strange thing. I was like, wait a minute. Am I reading something from 100 years ago, or am I reading something that's today? Because they were the same issues that we're dealing with today, they were dealing with back then. If you think dirty politics and fake news is something new, you're wrong. Quaddy Tidal Power Project had it all over it. It was one of the big lessons earlier in the project was it was not a local project. It was a national, it was an international story. And so it drew energy, debate from all parts of the world. Part of that debate was the electric supply. This project was going on at the early stages of electrification, and the demand was growing rapidly. So could they get enough power? And it had to get distributed. So was the grid up to the task, the distribution grid? And then also, what was the price? Because the cost of power, electric power, across the United States and Canada ranged by a factor about 10 to 1. So if you were at the low end, you were enjoying it. If you were at the high end, you were not enjoying those kinds of differentials. And it wasn't clear why that was happening. And when you get down to it, after or you boil all that down, the story is really about control of natural resources. And sometimes it's philosophy, that communist capitalist issue, it's politics, and it manifests itself in a number of different ways. Sometimes those manifestations are in native land claims. Big issue here, big issue in the United States as well. And other times it's the issue of monopoly. This is the time of the big trusts, and we now have a whole new generation of new mega monopolies and the power they have, but also the things that they can do. So these were debates, and sometimes these debates, these fights turn into actual conflict, actual wars. And the really astonishing thing is that the war in Ukraine is directly tied to the Quadi Tidal Power Project. And as that's pretty strange and a big claim, but you'll see that that is in fact true. So let's go on. Oh, come on. There. I'm not sure what's happening here. Oh, there we go. That's advancing, that's not. So, you all know where Passamaquoddy Bay is. Most of the people I talk to don't. The key parts here are that it's on the US-Canada border, because this made everything twice as complicated. And it's also part of the Bay of Fundy. So I like to talk about the Bay of Fundy having Passamaquoddy Bay be the left thumb of the Bay of Fundy. And everybody I talk to knows Bay of Fundy has the world's highest tides. And so let's see if I can get this. Oh, still not seeming to advance. Okay, so there we go. Thank you. So I'm not going to go into the dynamics of tides too much, but I'm going to give you a quick primer. The tides are the gravitational attraction of the Earth to the moon, and since the water is free to move, it does. And out in the Atlantic, the ocean tide is about 2 feet high. And so it's sloshing around the globe. And when it comes ashore, it gets towards the continental shelf, and the continental shelf basically acts just like a ramp or a wedge. And so as the ocean tide comes in over Georges Bank into the Gulf of Maine, it goes to about 10 feet. And then as it starts to turn and head up into the Bay of Fundy, it starts to get funneled in. And since it has less and less room to spread out, it goes up, and that's the funnel effect. So Passamaquoddy Bay, 20 feet or so for our tides. It gets funneled even further up into the fingers of the Bay of Fundy, and up there at that red arrow, 54 feet is just a phenomenal amount of tide. And the second dynamic is taking place here, which is called harmonic resonance, which is if you're in a bathtub, it's known as the bathtub effect, you make a little bit of harmonic movement back and forth, and you get big waves. That same thing is happening in the Gulf of Maine. The tide wave comes in, and it bounces back and forth, and the next tide wave comes in, and it reinforces it. So basically, it doubles it again. So all of that creates massive tides, massive movement of water. Movement of water is power. That's why we're talking about the Quadi Tidal Power Project. So, Quadi Bay is a really interesting bay. You know this, you live here. It's really big, 150 square miles. And it's very complicated. The geology is really interesting. It's hard rock, and it's got lots of islands in it. And those islands are really important to the story in a couple of different ways, which we'll get into, but particularly we're going to start off with 2 islands that are center of our story. One is Eastport, the city of Eastport on Moose Island in the United States, and just across the way is Campobello in Canada. So the 2 islands are very similar, but they're quite different. Eastport was the sardine capital of the world, they claimed. It was really the blue-collar working town, catching fish, producing fish. That's an extractive industry, and that industry had supported the town for hundreds of years, but it peaked in 1900. And so by the time our story really gets up to speed in the 1920s, it's already experiencing 2.5 decades of economic decline. And so they're looking for something to keep their town from shrinking, because it has been shrinking. So what new industry could reverse that situation? The same thing is happening on Campobello, but Campobello has had a different experience. Campobello gets developed, as you may know, as a resort. And there were great hotels on it, and they also peaked at 1900, and they too started to decline. St. Andrews continued to go because they had train access. We didn't have that convenience here. And so Campobello is also in a decline. But Campobello had someone interesting there, and of course that is Franklin Roosevelt. And his parents bought property on the island when he was 1 year old, and every summer thereafter they came up and spent the entire summer. And that's the cottage that mushroomed over time to become the Roosevelt cottage that his mother owned. And this is a 1936 photograph. I just like the yacht there. And on the right hand, this is a map that my cousin, who I discovered during this project, sent me. And it's a survey map from 1879 of Lubeck Narrows. And Lubeck Narrows is a really interesting place because, you know, it's a tidal strait. Lots of tidal water goes roaring through there. It's complicated, it's shallow, it's full of rocks, it's twisty, and that is Franklin Roosevelt's playground. Okay? So that's him at age 6. He's steering his father's 65-foot sailboat, and he is taught by his father, he's taught by the local fishermen, he's taught by the native Passamaquoddy chiefs how to handle a canoe. So he becomes a really expert sailor in every respect. He's really, really knowledgeable. And he's also has a very strong interest in maritime history, which he inherited from his whole family, in particular his uncle. All of that results that that baby face becomes this baby face. Franklin Roosevelt as young man, as the youngest Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy in U.S. history. Now, obviously, he had some connections to get that job, but he also really knew what he was doing, because look at the dates on that, 1913 to 1920. That means he held the job. He held the job during the entirety of World War I. And that gave him really critical experience for what we're going to talk about, because part of his job was that he was in charge of all new technology. And new technology at that time was all about electricity. Electricity. So he's dealing with all the famous people and all the new technology in that role. So he also, in that role, gets to play with some really cool boats, including this one. That's the USS Flusser. That is the fastest ship in the United States Navy. Franklin, 3 months into the job, takes that on a joyride through Lubeck Narrows. That's not a 6-knot sailboat. That can go 38 knots. He goes through it, I think it's 28 knots. He literally makes waves big enough to flip a few boats that are sitting on the shore. But he has a fabulous time, and it's something that he ends up doing a number of times. And we'll come back to that. So, but what do you see when you look at this picture? What's driving this thing? Coal, exactly. So coal is king, but again, this is a story about electricity. So electricity is coming on strong, and Franklin really is what I call, he was an electric native, the way we now talk about kids who are born with cell phones as being digital natives. So Franklin is born right after the birth of the electric industry. So if you think about Edison's invention of the practical light bulb in 1879, then 3 years later, Franklin is born. And so he is experiencing from the beginning the wonders of ever more electricity and ever more things that it can do. So again, he's got this built into himself. So if that's the birth of electricity, its coming out party is this. This is the Columbian Exposition, otherwise known as the Chicago World Fair. And the Chicago World Fair was designed to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the European discovery in North America, but it was also bragging rights for Chicago. Chicago had been growing like a weed, and they wanted to show off, and so they decided to throw a continental party. So they built a new city just for this party, this exhibition grounds, and they filled it with all the coolest stuff that they could find all over the world, and in particular new technologies, and in particular new electric technologies. They built the largest electric power plant in the world, and they lit it with 250,000 light bulbs. It's the first installation of something new called alternating current, designed by Mr. Tesla. It becomes known as the White City. All that light attracts an enormous crowd. 27 million people go to see this thing. And that's just a mind-bogglingly large number of people to go to a single event. But when you put it in context of the population in the United States at the time, it was equal to 43% of the country. So project forward to now, that'd be something like 180 million people going to a single event. It was just wildly successful. And so all those people took trains from all over the country, and they converged in Chicago. They spent their day, their week, their month, however long, having a fabulous time, eating all kinds of junk food and exotic things, getting their mind blown. And after their wonderful time, they got back onto those trains. They went, oh, it's like, wow, I'm tired. And they're thinking, I want all that stuff at home. All those cool toys, all that electrical equipment, all of those things. And that experience created Disneyland as a result, but it also drove what was already happening, which was a mad dash to create more electricity. So where you could produce it and where you could sell it. So places where water was moving, waterfalls, that's where you produce power, and you need a city where you can sell it. So if you are this is happening worldwide, but particularly in the United States, if you wanted to build a really big power plant somewhere in the United States, you're looking for a really big waterfall, where would you go? Thank you. Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls had been the site of power production for a long time, but always just on the edge because it's so big that nobody could hold the whole thing. But they started building it, and a couple people that we're going to talk about, Hugh and Dexter Cooper. They are sons of millwrights. Hugh is the older but shorter brother. He's about this big with a head about this big, apparently. And Dexter is 17-year younger brother. And they have been building mills, power plants for a while. And they get hired to build this plant, which is the Toronto Generating Station on the Niagara River, right above the falls. And they're hired because Hugh proposes to do something that is really dramatic. They have to work around some other power plants, etc. So the question is, how do you get the water in and out? And Hugh designs a system which Lord Kelvin, the most famous scientist alive at the time, says can't be done. Hugh says, just watch me. So they build this dam. It's going to be a two-part discussion. So first of all, you got to get the water into the power plant. And so what they did was they built a diversionary wing dam, which, if I could, it's that line. See that big yellow arrow? There's that line that leads into the building. That is directing part of the flow of the river into the building. And to build that, they had to go work their way out into the current, to build that wing dam, and that's them at the end of the current with the Niagara River roaring by. And by the way, at this scale, oh, this is very convenient. I'd be standing just about at the edge of the Niagara Falls on that photograph. So if you fell in while you were doing that, you'd fall into the Niagara River, and then you'd fall off the cliff. So very dangerous work. And the second question was, how do you get the water out? Because you want it to drop all 300 feet. And so Hugh said, I'm going to do a tunnel straight down 300 feet, and then I'm going to go make a 90-degree turn, and I'm going to go out and have the exit underneath Horseshoe Falls. So just imagine digging a tunnel underneath Horseshoe Falls with a couple of 100 million horsepower going over your head. So they do it. And that becomes the world's largest hydroelectric power plant. It's 10 times bigger than anything else that is in existence when they build it. When they build it, you can only transmit power 3 miles. They build it on the bet that technology will advance so fast that when they're done, 3 years later, it will be able to be delivered 25 miles to Toronto. And thanks to Tesla, it does. Okay, so, oh, I should back up, quick. Okay, if you're the Cooper brothers, you've just built the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, what do you do next? You build a bigger one on the Mississippi River. This is Keokuk, Iowa, and Cooper brothers, again, develop all kinds of new technology. This one is interesting because they're building it as a single monolithic piece of concrete. They figure out how to pour concrete 24 hours a day, 12 months a year, so that it fuses into one massive piece of concrete. And as a result, they're able to tame the Mississippi River. And this, again, is the largest hydroelectric power plant. And again, when they start building it, they can't deliver the power, but by the time they're done, they can deliver 200 miles. So, if you're the Cooper brothers, and you've just built the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, what do? Okay. This one's on the Tennessee River at Muscle Shoals, Alabama. It becomes known as the Wilson Dam. Now, the interesting thing here is that they didn't actually start this one. The United States Army Corps of Engineers started building this one, but they got in trouble. And so they called the best dam engineers in the world to come and fix it. And the Cooper brothers redesigned it and then finished construction. And it became the world's largest hydroelectric power plant. So why is the Army Corps of Engineers building a hydroelectric power plant in Alabama? And the answer is that you need power to produce nitrates. Nitrates are the basic ingredient of explosives. And this was being built during World War I. But World War I finished before they finished the dam. And so the question became, what do you do with it? This is 150 million, depending on your estimates, 100 million plus project. And so it sits there. And the local electric utility company said, we are the monopoly. We have the sole right to produce power, the sole right to sell the power in this territory. Either give it to us or destroy it. $100 million of your money. Give it to us or destroy it. That leaves a conundrum. And this plant sits idle for years as the debate rages about what to do. But time goes on. So if you're the Cooper brothers, what are you thinking about? A bigger one. And Dexter is now thinking about, oh, I skipped over something. Hold on. Back in Keokuk, Iowa, Dexter meets a young lady named Gertrude Sturgis. Gertrude Strudis is a Boston Brahmin, beautiful young lady. She's out there visiting her brother, who's working for the railroad, and she meets Dexter Cooper. They fall in love, get married, and they go on vacation, a honeymoon. Where did they go? Very good. And have a wonderful time. And in fact, they have such a wonderful time that something really unique is conceived. It's not their daughter. It's the Quaddy Tidal Power Project is conceived on their honeymoon. But Quaddy Tidal Power Project is an elephant. It takes a long time to gestate. And so Dexter has been thinking about it for years. And when the Muscle Shoals plant is done, he actually starts working on it full time. Because the Mississippi, the St. Lawrence, the Tennessee are all pipsqueaks compared to the Bay of Fundy. Go forward. Bay of Fundy in a day moves more water than all the rivers of the world combined. So that's just an enormous amount of water. It's just mind-boggling, 100 billion tons. I don't know what that means. That's just a lot of water. All of that movement is an enormous amount of power. If you could capture the movement of the tides in the Bay of Fundy, it would be the equivalent of 250 nuclear power plants. That's more power than all the nuclear power plants in North America combined. So the question is, how do you hold the ocean? And that's where Passamaquoddy Bay comes into play. So let's talk for a minute before we go further about the difference between tide power and river power, because that's really where the experience has been, is about damming rivers. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both of those things. The advantage for tides is that they're totally predictable. The weather is not very predictable, as we know, but tides are, because tides are astronomy, and astronomy is math, and if you do enough math, you can predict the tide at any place on Earth, at any date in the past or the future. So for business models, that kind of predictability is absolute nirvana. And that predictability goes with it, which is, unlike rivers, the ocean never experiences a drought. You always have the raw material, the water. The problem with tides for generating power is it's intermittent. So there are old-fashioned tide mills around here. The way they basically worked was the same idea. You have a nice little cove. You build a dam across it with a gate. You open the gate. You let the tide come in. You close the gate. And then all that water has to spill out over your water wheel or under your water wheel or into your turbine in any case. That's how you get it. So you're only really producing energy as on the ebb, as it's flowing out. So at best, a traditional tide power plant only produces power half the time. And it's a confusing half of the time because the tides happen 50 minutes later each day, so you're only half of the time just keeps moving along. And for business models, this is really terrible because when you want to sell power is when people want it, and they typically want it in a regular period of time, not at 2 in the morning. So that's the disadvantage. The common thing about all hydroelectric power plants, traditional ones, is that they're big infrastructure. You're going to build a big dam, which is very expensive up front, but once you've built it, it will last pretty much forever. As opposed to, you can buy a little gas-powered generator, cheap, but you will always be repairing it, and you will always be paying for the fuel, and the fuel will always get more expensive. So that's the parameters that Dexter's trying to deal with, how to grab the ocean and these kinds of things, and do it in an efficient manner. And so he comes up with what becomes known as the international plan, because it's going to be international in scope. He proposes to build dams across all of Passamaquoddy Bay and enclose the entire thing as one massive 150 square mile mill pond. And he's going to use the landscape to take advantage of the landscape to do it efficiently. Because instead of building one gigantic dam from Lubeck to Letite, 14 miles, he's going to build a series of dams from Lubeck to Campobello, Campobello to Deer Island to Letite, and thereby cut the total amount of dams he needs to do by less than half. And so he's figured out how to do it cost efficiently. And the next thing he does is that he takes an idea that was originally developed in Boston. If anyone's been to Back Bay, Boston was an enormous tide pool. And they had two. And the idea with having two is that you can always have one high and one low, and put your turbine between them, and therefore you always have a waterfall, and therefore you can always generate power. So you configure it such that whenever the tide's coming in, you use that to top off the glass for the high pool, and whenever the tide is going out, you let all the water in the low pool spill out so that you always maintain this differential. And Dexter did all kinds of calculations and so forth, and he could maintain 8 to 25 feet of differential on that thing. So he could generate massive amounts of power efficiently at all times. That's the international plan from 1925. It's going to be both countries. It's going to be a $100 million project, which in current dollars, that's about $2 billion worth of construction. And it will be the world's largest. And he does something else that's different now, which is in the past, he had always worked with his older brother, who had always been the primary engineer, and Dexter had always been the construction manager. In this case, Dexter says, I'm going to do it all myself. I'm going to be CEO, I'm going to be the chief engineer, I'm going to be the chief construction manager. And so he proposes what is technically, financially, in every way, a massive, aggressive project, and he's going to do it all himself. And he's going to do it as a for-profit project. So, big ideas, big projects, but he is not the only person who wants to produce power and make a lot of money from it. One other group is Central Maine Power Company. Central Maine Power Company at this time is just a little local monopoly. But those little local monopolies were wildly profitable, and so they used that money to buy up their neighbors and become a bigger local monopoly. And then they used that money to buy up more of their neighbors and become a bigger monopoly. And they felt like they weren't growing fast enough, so they called up some guys from Chicago and said, we want to take some of your funds and leverage ourselves up so that we can buy even more stuff, so we can get even bigger. And so they do that. They keep buying, and they don't stop with buying other power producers. They start buying other power consumers, the manufacturing companies, so they could guarantee themselves an ever bigger market. Then they started buying other utilities, drinking water companies, because they like the monopoly model. They buy transportation companies, then they buy the banks, then they buy the newspapers. So by the time they're at their peak, they're controlling 17 industries in Maine and massive amounts of economic power and political power that goes with it. And that political power manifests itself in a couple of interesting ways. The guy on the left is Mr. Perkins. Don't know too much about him. The second guy with the cigar, chomping on the cigar, that's Walter Wyman. He's got a dam named after him. He is as hard-bitten as he looks. The third guy is Martin Insel. He and his brother are from Chicago. They individually, they personally control 11% of the national electricity produced in the United States. So vast amounts of control and power. And the guy on the right is really interesting. He's William Skelton. He is the former chairman of the Maine State Department of Public Utility Control. So yeah, you're rolling your eyes, you're shaking your head. Do you think that's a little bit of a conflict of interest? You're right. And this is happening all over the country. This is just a little example of what is a mad dash and a huge expansion. And the industry, the demand for power is mushrooming, but this is going even faster. There's so much money moving, and the valuations are so wild that the people who are watching are starting to get worried. That, is this sustainable, or are we headed for trouble? And ultimately, that comes to result in the United States Senate launching an investigation into what is going on in the electric power industry. And they put in charge this guy, Hugo Black, a senator from Alabama. So he's got some direct experience with utilities and how they behave. And he sets up public hearings at the Senate, and one of his first witnesses that he subpoenas is this guy, Howard Hobson. And he's a CEO of one of these big conglomerates in the middle Atlantic states of the United States. And Hugo Black is a brilliant lawyer. He attacks and pretty quickly breaks the armor and starts to expose the misbehavior and the inflated values and the straight-out fraud that this guy personally is involved in, and that more broadly the entire industry is doing all kinds of very, very shady behaviors, financial behaviors. But just like in Maine, most of the press at this time is controlled by the conservative Republican Party, and they are very closely aligned with power companies. So all of the stuff that comes out from this, the 9,000-page report, basically gets buried. And nothing really changes. But he does his job really well. He goes to jail, and he goes to the United States Supreme Court. And this will play into our project as we go forward. So something's happening. Oh, sorry about that. I forgot it. Indeed, I forgot I had this on. There we go. And he goes to the Supreme Court. So on we go. Don't try to read that slide. The point is that Dexter is now working full-time, trying to get all that is on his list of things that he has got to do, and it would be a challenge even if it were in a single country, but it's two countries. Because everything he's got to do, all of those kinds of political things, all of the permits and approvals, he's got to do it twice. And one of the things that happens along the way is that you modify your proposal based on response from all these different markets. And one of those things is that Canada says, we're concerned about the effect on the fisheries industry. The American fisheries industry said, we're headed downhill, so go ahead because we're headed down in any case. The Canadians said, no, we want to know what's the effect. And so they required a study to be done, and that study was going to take 3 years. So Dexter gets back on the train at St. Andrews, goes out to Ottawa, and says, okay, would you please extend my permits so that you can do your study and that we can get all this stuff and then put it together at the end when you get done your study. And so a routine process, and then suddenly something happens, that the meeting shifts and they call a vote, and suddenly the whole thing is voted down and it's strictly on party lines. And so Quaddy is killed. So the whole international plan is stopped because they don't extend the permits to do the work that they had themselves required. And the question became, who killed Quaddy? And that's the expression that was used in the newspaper at the time, because it was so sudden and it was so party line driven that something was up. And so the question was, who killed Quaddy? Was it the Canadian fishing industry, which, by the way, Dexter had said, the stakes are so high that any losses you have, I will guarantee your losses. So it's not a financial issue. But was it the Canadian fishing industry that killed Quaddy in that meeting? Or was it something going on with the politicians that had to be figured out? Or was it the American power companies that had found a way to kill the competitive threat that they saw in quality and do it somewhere else. I'm not going to tell you yet. So Dexter starts work immediately on a new, smaller scale project, trying to start just the United States, but it's 1929, and the crash happens. And so the stock market crash, as you know, results from a speculative bubble in the stock market. The biggest part of that bubble is the electric utility industry, who had created false valuations in order to get more and more leverage, in order to attract more and more investors, in order to get more and more profit. And so that whole thing comes crashing down. And the Insull brothers, who controlled Midwest Utilities, they result in the largest bankruptcy in United States history because the whole thing was based on inflated values. And Maine's, it takes a decade to untangle the mess in Maine that it results from the Insull brothers in Chicago. So the stock market collapse causes one of the causes of the Great Depression. That means that there's no money available to do anything, and particularly not anything of that kind of scale or that kind of novelty as a quasi-tidal power project. So the whole thing goes quiescent. Dexter stays in his office and works away, but really there's nothing happening. But there is something happening, because something has to happen. The Depression is a disaster. We have to address it. And Franklin Roosevelt, who at this point is governor of New York, is saying, I've seen it going on. I understand what the dynamics are, and I think I have a way to fix it. And it's called the New Deal. And the New Deal is basically the social restructuring of the economy, so that instead of having a pyramid structure where the whole thing is designed to benefit a few, he's basically saying, let's reconceive our economy and restructure it so that it benefits the mass of the people. And that's the New Deal. And the New Deal is going to go about that by instituting a series of programs: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is emergency humanitarian aid for the people who need it, the people who are out of work, who need jobs, who need food and shelter. This is the dole. It's just straight expense. Do it now. They need help. Recovery is really the idea of let's build the foundation for future prosperity. So this is make work jobs, but building the infrastructure that will provide our future. And this is deficit spending. And then the third thing is reform, which is to say, let's fix what's broken. And the banking industry was the first thing to get fixed, and the electric power industry and re-regulating what was hardly regulated was part of that as well. And when you put all those things together, the most spectacular example of that is Franklin Roosevelt's public power initiatives, which we'll get back to at time. But anyhow, this idea of restructuring, do something immediate, let's work on the system, let's build a better future, appeals to the American people, and Franklin Roosevelt is elected president. And he does not wait to get going on this program, because it is a national emergency. In Maine, it's nationally, there's 30% unemployment. In eastern Maine, it's 60% unemployment. So there is a crisis here, and action has to take place. So before he's even sworn in as president, he's going down to Muscle Shoals. At the invitation of that guy with the bow tie, George Norris, a Republican senator from Nebraska. Now, what you would ask is a Republican senator from Nebraska doing at Alabama with the Democratic president-elect? And the answer is that George Norris is a very independent thinker, and he has an idea that instead of demolishing that $100+ million power plant, let's use it as part of that New Deal. Let's use it as a government-sponsored regional economic development for all the people in the area based on hydropower. And Franklin loves this idea. He sees this as a way of really taking a government which had been largely reactive and making it proactive. And so he says, let's do it. And he immediately starts to act on this. And if you wanted to know more about Muscle Shoals and how to build hydroelectric power plants and run them, who would you call? The Cooper brothers, your next door neighbors on Campobello. And what do you think the Cooper brothers are doing at this very moment? They're building a bigger dam, but it's not in the United States. It's not in Canada. We're all in the Depression. It's in Soviet Union, Ukraine. They're building the world's largest hydroelectric power plant on the Dnieper River in Soviet Ukraine. That's a picture of Hugh Cooper, and that's the dam. These two pictures were taken by Margaret Bark White, one of the most famous photographers of the 1930s, and that's Life magazine. So, as I said, there's a connection here to what's going on in Ukraine. And this is a really interesting project because if you are a pair of American capitalists, what are you doing? Who are you working for if you're in Soviet Ukraine? You're working for a batch of communists. Who? Joseph Stalin. Hugh Cooper, who only has a high school education, who's the best dam builder in the world, debates economic policy with Joseph Stalin. He convinces Joseph Stalin that the Soviet system isn't good enough because there aren't enough financial incentives. So they actually modify the system. It's called the New Economic Plan. And Hugh Cooper has this kind of access to Joseph Stalin because the Dnieper Dam is the centerpiece of the transformation of the Soviet economy from rural agrarian to modern industrial. It is a government-sponsored regional economic development plan. That's where George Norris, the Republican, gets his idea. Okay, so Hugh Cooper and his little brother, Dexter, deliver the Dnieper Dam on budget, on schedule. It's the biggest piece of infrastructure in the Soviet Union, and it is such an enormous, successful project for them that Hugh is awarded that medal, which is the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which is the highest civilian award you can be given in Russia. It's like the equivalent of the presidential honor. And Hugh is the first foreigner to receive this award. Okay. So, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president. 5 weeks later, he has a meeting in the White House with Senator Norris, U.S. Secretary of Foreign Affairs Cordell Hull, and Hugh Cooper. And they have a really interesting agenda. Number one, Hugh Cooper is arguing for diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union. It's been 17 years since the Russian Revolution, but most of Europe and the United States had not recognized the Soviet Union as a country. And Hugh is arguing that he and General Electric, who supplied all the equipment for the Dnieper Dam, are perfect examples of the growth market that the Soviet Union represents. In other words, it's jobs for Americans by exporting expertise and equipment to the Soviet Union. And that's important at the moment because during the Depression, the U.S. Exports go down 50%. During this time, Russian imports going up 100%. And it's all industrial equipment that's tied to the dam. Secondly, they, of course, are talking about Muscle Shoals as the centerpiece of the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the first U.S. regional economic development initiative sponsored by the government for using hydroelectric power. And Hugh proposes his little brother's project, the Quaddy Tidal Power Project, be taken over and switch from a private enterprise to one of those government-sponsored regional economic development projects based on hydropower. So we just made a big switch. And Franklin Roosevelt, again, acts on these things. And in fact, the Soviet Union is recognized a few months later. And that, oh, back up one. No, there we go. Back to the flag. There we go. That's Hugh Cooper again, standing with the Russian foreign minister. This is at the party at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, celebrating the recognition of the Soviet Union. And Hugh is actually the host because he is now the president of the American-Russian Chamber of Commerce. Capitalism, communism, all together, thank you. All right, so I forget what's coming next. Yeah, so while all this is going on, that public power initiatives that Franklin had were being viewed by the private power companies as absolute existential threats to their business. They were worried they were going to get legislated out of existence, and so they fought it every which way you can think of, and a number of those things resulted in Supreme Court cases. And ultimately, all of those court cases were determined in favor of the Roosevelt administration, that they were creating public power initiatives to compete with private power to ensure that they were being fairly priced was a legitimate function of government. And so this cartoon I love because this is the fat cat private power companies crying a river over the loss of Muscle Shoals. And so when the last Supreme Court case was solved, which, by the way, Hugo Black was part of the Supreme Court that decided it, that cleared all the legal hurdles for Quaddy to go forward. But there was a lot of other hurdles. And just, by the way, I love this poster of the TVA. It has a decidedly socialist aesthetic to it. While the legal hassles were going on, Quaddy was being debated. There were all kinds of studies that were produced about the engineering, about the economics. Some of these were public processes, some of these were private processes, some of these were done competitively against it, some of these things were top secret government reports. And all of this is swirling around for years. And ultimately, finally, Franklin says, Maine is still in crisis. We need jobs for Maine. Quaddy can supply construction jobs. Let's do it for that purpose first. The trust busting, the other things are all good, but I'm going to approve it. I'm going to approve the All-American Plan, a little version, all within Cobb's-Cook Bay in the United States, as a jobs program, because it's going to produce 5,000 jobs for 5 years. And that'll cost about $35 million. And we are in crisis mode, so I'm using my executive authority, which has been granted me to deal with this emergency. I'm using funds from this year's budget. Start now. This is April. He wants it under construction by July 4th. And so they do. Eastport, as you know, has always had a July 4th party. They decided to have a really big one. And instead of starting off with fireworks, they started off with dynamite. 600 pounds of it was buried into the ground. They blew the lid off of it and created a great big show. And this guy over here with the shovel in his hand is not Dexter Cooper, because Dexter Cooper has been shoved aside. That is Philip Fleming of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. So why are the Army Corps of Engineers building this dam? Because that's who you hire. If you're the federal government, you hire the Army Corps of Engineers. And do you remember when we talked about the Muscle Shoals Dam? That the Cooper brothers came in and rescued the dam from the problem? So if you were the guy who hired the Cooper brothers, you were delighted with the results. If you were the guy who got fired, you were not happy. And so the idea of having the Cooper brothers in charge of the Army Corps of Engineers was not appreciated by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they shoved him aside. And in fact, they shoved all of his work aside. Dexter had spent 10 years investigating and planning the Quoddy Tidal Power Project. They threw it all out. They started from scratch. And while Dexter was the best dam engineer in the world, built all of the largest dams in the world, nobody on the project had ever built a dam. But they had a lot of work to do because they had 5,000 employees to get to solve that employment problem. So they had to build a city first. Because Eastport was 3,500 people at this time, so where are you going to put another 5,000 people? And so they had to build what became known as Quoddy Village. This is an aerial photograph of the central section of Quoddy Village. There are all kinds of other things in the periphery, but it had worker barracks for folks. It had single-family homes. It had duplexes. It had apartment buildings. It had all kinds of shops. It had movie theater and gymnasium. And this huge building right here is the administration building. It's 245 feet long. It has 486 desks, 245 windows, I think. And it has, next, gold-plated mailboxes. It's so elaborate with that Greek pedimented columns out front and the lantern and clock tower and paneled offices and a fleet of chauffeured cars that it pretty quickly gets known as a boondoggle. A boondoggle has a really interesting story. Boondoggle started out, we think, as a term from Daniel Boone, the frontiersman, who used to tie stuff on to his clothes so that his hands were free, so for when he had to cross streams in the wilderness. And that then becomes a fancy knot that the Boy Scouts tied for their neckerchiefs. And so that's all still knots, right? Then at about this time, just before this building goes up, the Boston Herald, a Republican-controlled paper, who is very much against the New Deal, says, it complains about the make-work aspects of the New Deal, particularly the idea of hiring craftsmen and artists to be craftsmen and artists. And one of the examples they give is knot tying. And so a boondoggle, because of that editorial, takes on the meaning of wasteful government spending. And almost immediately, that idea is applied to that building particularly, and more broadly to the whole Quoddy Tidal Power Project, because it is becoming very expensive. The budget is going up fast because of the way the Army Corps of Engineers is doing it. It's a very strange project because how are you supposed to harness the ocean? And the power companies say not only can it not be done, it's not needed. There's no need for this entire thing. It's a total, complete waste of time. It's a boondoggle. So, but the Army builds this in 6 months flat. They start on July 4th. By Christmas, they have everybody housed and 5,124 employees all working away. So it's a phenomenal success. It's so interesting what's going on in Eastport between the tidal project and this city that they built in such a handsome fashion and so fast that 250,000 people come to see Quoddy Village. This is a town of 3,500 people. Eastport was before this thing happens. And so they actually do eventually start building the actual dams that winter. And, oh, keep going, there we go. And so unlike the other dams that the Coopers had done in the past, which were mostly concrete, the Coopers had said, let's use what they call earth-fill dams, which is basically you find a hill, you drill a lot of holes in it, you put a whole lot of dynamite, you blow it to smithereens. You scoop it all up, put it in dump trucks, drive it over to the edge of the ocean, and dump it into the ocean. And you just keep on doing that until you've gone all the way across from island to island to island. Tens of thousands of dump truck loads. And so that's what they're doing here. They're beginning that process. They're blasting to create the rock, and you put rock and then clay, rock and clay. And so you build this durable, watertight, massive dam, which has a cross-section like this. So it's a whole lot of dirt you're moving. And in the background, you can just barely see it, is Pleasant Point. And this first section of dam is going to Carlo Island, which is where this photographer is standing. And that is the road that you now take into Eastport. The road is the Quoddy Dam, the first piece of the Quoddy Dam. It's the causeway, exactly. So, so these were little sections. They weren't very long, they weren't very deep, but they had to start and they had to get the process underway, and so they were going. And so, with all of this progress that they were making, nonetheless, Quoddy was being ridiculed. Quoddy was being, it was in the papers everywhere, all across the country. To give you a sense of it, the Boston Herald, New York Times covered Quoddy 200 times. The Boston Herald covered it 500 times. It was huge news. It was covered in other newspapers all around the area. And a lot of it was negative, and a lot of it was derisive in its nature. And so here's it's just some of the cartoons. One's on the left is harnessing the ocean, making fun of that, and that's from the Buffalo paper. This one is from New York City, the same kind of idea of harnessing a walrus. And then this one's making fun of the financial aspects of it. And this one is from Duluth, Minnesota. And so they're all across the country, this is being attacked. But they're making progress. So this is 1936 at this point, and in entrepreneurial circles, there's this concept of a proof point, where if you're an entrepreneur, you're doing something new, and you're always saying, this is what the future is, and you're waiting for evidence. And the evidence was right here. That Dexter had always said that you can't rely on any single source of power, no matter what. It will have its problems, its limits, its failures, and so you need to diversify your power. And in fact, one of the problems with river power is rivers flood. In 1936, the entire east coast of the United States was being flooded. They had to sandbag the capital in Washington, D.C. A lot of rivers in Maine flooded. This is Central Maine Power Company's Brunswick Power Plant on the Androscoggin, underwater. A lot of the power plants in Maine were underwater. And Maine was without power for a while because of this. And so here it is, Dexter's saying, if you had a tidal power plant, you wouldn't have this problem. You would have reliable power. Because the tides are big in the Bay of Fundy, but they range in Passamaquoddy Bay from 8 to 26 feet, so that's really only a 3 to 1 range. This river has a range from summer to low flow to spring flood of 200 to 1. That's hard to manage. And that's the result of when you can't manage it. So that's proof 1 point. This is all 1936, middle of the year. Another proof point comes up, which is the power companies have said for years that absolutely no need for this power. There's no one who will buy it. Dexter had been given 5 years to show up with a customer. Basically, that was what he was told to do. Don't have anything to do with the engineering. We don't want you, but we do want someone to buy this power when it's available 5 years from now. Dexter delivers it in 9 months. Okay? But he is not empowered to sign contracts. In fact, no one is empowered to sign contracts. So this is a bit of a problem. And it's for when the project is done. It's not now. So how do you deal with this information? What do you do with it? And another part is that not only was there a market for jobs, but the whole premise of the Public Power Initiative is that it laid the foundation for future prosperity. Future prosperity is jobs. And these companies that were going to use the power were going to create 3,000 jobs in eastern Maine. So here's the proof that we need it, there's a market for it, and that it creates jobs. But he can't reveal the names, because if he revealed the names of the companies, he would be exposing their competitive plans to their competitors. He would also be exposing his market to the other companies. So he is immediately branded a liar. So, on we go. Time moves on, and in fact, this man, Time Man of the Year, Arthur Vandenberg, wants to be president, and he is running against Franklin Roosevelt. He is a very smart guy. He's also a very funny guy. And he decides that he is against the New Deal, and therefore he's going to use Quaddy as his point of attack on the New Deal. So Quaddy is no longer a Maine thing, it's now a national issue and national political issue. And he is very smart, he's very funny, and he invents the word moondoggle. Because, of course, it was the world's biggest boondoggle, and it was a lunatic idea to try to use moon-generated tides to make electricity. So that's how it happens. By the way, there are a lot of people who think that moondoggle, the term, was invented in 1963 and it referred to the Apollo space program in the Kennedy administration. That's not true. That's where it came from. So, have you ever been to the Senate or watched on C-SPAN and you see that the Senate, they have these funny little two-person desks and they're all in alphabetical order? So Michigan sits next to Maine. And so Arthur Vandenberg, the Republican who wants to become president, who is using Quaddy as the method of his attack against the New Deal, the basis of his campaign for president, is sitting next to, is seatmates with, Frederick Hale, senator from Maine. And Quaddy is in trouble at this point because it's a highly controversial project. The power companies are doing everything they can do to stop it. It has become a political issue. It's also become a regional issue where everybody's fighting, different regions of the country are fighting each other for the scraps of the New Deal. And Maine is in a mess. Maine's got 60% unemployment. And so Governor Brand, a Democratic governor of Maine, says, you know, we got to deal with the problem, not the problems that we're creating. And so let's figure out a way to get the politics out of this. And he strikes a deal with the governor of Florida. And Florida has another highly controversial project called the Florida Ship Canal. And he says, let's put our two projects together and have them reviewed by the same panel of technical experts. And if they pass, either one or the other, or both, or none, that'll be the end of the discussion. But we have to make decisions, and it's got to be based on the merits. And let's get past all this sectionalism, this regional antagonisms, and let's do it that way. And so he gets agreement from Florida. He gets agreement from a lot of the other senators. He's a governor, but he gets agreement from the senators that this is the way to move forward, get past the politics and get on to solutions, one way or the other. Let the chips fall as they may. So he's got this deal. It comes up for a vote, and at the last second, Frederick Hale, the senator from Maine, splits the baby. He says, I don't want to do this. Don't vote us as a package. I want to split it into separate things, and I want Quaddy, my project, to be voted first. Yeah, I saw that wince. That's pretty much how everybody voted because they saw what was going on. This was a stab in the back. This was a plan to approve one and then not approve the other. Not the project, but the review under the same basis. And so he was stacking the deck. And so instead of a positive vote, Quaddy is killed. And in fact, it's not even close. Even George Norris, the father of public power, votes against it because he sees what's happened. And so Quaddy is killed. So who killed Quaddy this time? Is it Frederick Hale, who is doing something politics in Maine against the Democratic governor? Or was it Arthur Vandenberg who schemed this whole thing? Or was it the power companies who are, again, pulling all the strings behind the scenes? Or was it the United States Army Corps of Engineers, who now seem to be spending money at deliberately accelerated rates? Or was it somebody else? It didn't matter, because one person could change that. Franklin Roosevelt still had the executive authority, still had the budget, and was coming to Campobello. So what's he going to do? At this point, Quaddy is an enormous political hassle. It is an embarrassment because it is way over budget. It is being attacked by every angle. What's he going to do? So he goes. It's not clear that he's going to go to and look, but he eventually is convinced to go and tour Quaddy Village, tour the construction site. And he does all of that, and he goes to a building that they had built at Quaddy Village called the Exhibit Hall, because they had 250,000 people come. They had to have some place where they could show people what was going on. And the center point of that exhibit hall, that is full of exhibits about the Quaddy Tidal Power Project, is what they call the action model. It's a working model of the Quaddy Tidal Power Project. It's made of 8 tons of concrete and steel. It has water that flows in and out of it. It's still in existence. It's in Eastport. And it was so effective at explaining things that people came away saying, I get it. And Franklin Roosevelt, who, as you know, is crippled because of polio, he arrives in his touring car after having gone all around Quaddy Village, seen all the construction sites, and he walks into the exhibit hall, which he can do, but he only does it on rare occasions because it's very difficult. So if he does it, it means it's important. He spends 20 minutes talking with the engineers. That's 2 of them beside him. The guy with the dark hat is Philip Fleming, the guy who we saw shoveling the first shovel. And he's clearly very engaged. He gets up, he walks out again, back to his car, climbs in the car, and someone asks him what's next. And he responds, when I get back next year, I hope it will be in operation. That's nice, but that is not, I will. But he does get into his car, he drives down to the wharf, gets into the presidential yacht, sails across Passamaquoddy Bay to St. Andrews, gets on the train, and goes to Ottawa, where he's talking to the premier. So there's lots going on behind the scenes at the highest levels, but that's not what the public is seeing. The public is seeing this. This is the march of time. Time magazine had a newsreel service, and they did these documentaries on issues of the day. And one of them that they do is an 8-minute section on the Quaddy Tidal Power Project. And it debuts at 10,000 theaters throughout the English-speaking world, which means millions of people see it. And it's a really interesting thing. It's very hard to come by. But I eventually found a copy, and I analyzed it frame by frame, word by word, musical note by musical note. And I had to do this because I couldn't figure out what it was. Was it journalism or was it propaganda? Because there's been a whole lot of fake news and a whole lot of propaganda throughout this entire project. So what is this thing? I'll give you a hint. Five times in 8 minutes. It's very effective. So this is what the world has seen about the Quadi Tidal Power Project. But Quadi is dealing not with this kind of stuff, but with reality. Because when the Quadi Tidal Power Project was canceled, 5,124 people lost their jobs. Those were the direct employees. That's not including all the people who depended on those people for their jobs. And so this is a very famous photograph. It's called the Army of the Unemployed. If you go to Google or whatever and type in unemployed Great Depression, this photograph will come up. It almost never comes up with a caption, but it is Eastport. It is some of the people who were thrown out of work. Its original caption has some of those negative terms and so forth. It just talks about being thrown out of work after pouring all this money into the ocean. But of course, it's not because of the project, it's because of the politics, the thing that was killed. So 5,124 people lose their jobs. All that brings down the local businesses. So all kinds of businesses in Eastport go bankrupt. And in fact, Eastport itself goes bankrupt. Eastport had been promised thousands and thousands of dollars of aid to support all this influx of people and all the services they were going to need, ranging from police to sanitation to water, etc. Eastport does not receive a single penny. Eastport goes bankrupt. The mayor at the time, Roscoe Emery, who was also the publisher of the newspaper, said, "This is a disaster from which we will not recover for generations." It's also a disaster for Dexter Cooper. He dies a little bit later. His doctor said if there was ever a case of someone dying of a broken heart, it was him. He had simply had his life crushed out of him. That he had achieved so much, he had gotten so close so many times, but he was against odds which were just so big. And so he dies in 1938. He's buried on Campobello. There is a truly moving obituary written by the St. Croix Times for Dexter Cooper. I printed it in whole in the book because it's so well written. 1938 is a bad year all around. The Depression is still going on. It's driving all kinds of political tensions. It's turning into nationalism. In Europe, it's turning into Nazism. And that erupts in 1939 as World War II, when the Nazis invade Poland. England honors their treaty alliance with Poland. That puts them into the war. Canada is part of Great Britain, therefore Canada is in the war. Therefore, all of Canada's thoughts are now shifting towards war, and Quadi is once again quiescent. But things continue. So let's talk about what power produces. Electrical power produces nitrates. It also produces aluminum. It's the primary component besides alum powder. You need a lot of electricity to make aluminum. You need a lot of aluminum to make planes. When the United States entered World War II, or at the beginning of World War II, the United States had 200 planes. So this little teeny plane over here represents 200 planes. That's the entire combat air force of the United States is 200 planes when World War II begins. Franklin Roosevelt estimates that we will need 50,000 planes at least, maybe per year, if we're going to win World War II. And that's a lot of power. You need a lot of power to produce that many planes. The United States enters the war when Japan bombs Pearl Harbor with 253 planes. So that single battle involves almost twice as many planes as we had at the start of the war. And that brings us into the war. The war takes another major turn when Nazi Germany turns on their own allies, the Soviet Union, and invades the Soviet Union. And they invade it with the largest invasion force in history with 2,700 planes and 3.5 million troops. That invasion force is headed to the Dnieper River, because the Dnieper River is the largest industrial asset in the Soviet Union. It was designed to build manufacturing plants. Two of those biggest plants are the nitrates for the ammunitions, and Soviet Union became, by this point, the largest producer of aluminum in the world. They're headed for the Ukraine. Joseph Stalin, the man who hired the Cooper brothers to build the world's largest hydroelectric power plant, saw the Nazis coming and did not want to lose that asset. He did not want it to fall into the hands of the Nazis. And so, under the coldest of calculus, he orders the dam to be blown. And it was done with tons of dynamite that had been built into the dam by the Cooper brothers at the insistence of Joseph Stalin. This dam is not the one that was recently blown up. This is upstream of the one that was recently blown up. This is 3 times bigger. That cost thousands of lives. We have no idea whether it was 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000 lives, but that's the result. And this lesson was understood by the powers that be and made explicit in this poster from the TVA. Air power, military power, comes straight from water power, because that's how you manufacture planes and ammunition. And in fact, it was Roosevelt's public power initiatives, the Tennessee River Dam, the Colorado Dam, the great dams on the Columbia River, that produced the vast majority of the net increase in power that the United States had during the war, that produced the arsenal of democracy, the miracle of American manufacturing that won the war. It was Franklin Roosevelt's leadership and the power that did it. We won the war, of course, but Franklin didn't last long enough. He died just a few weeks beforehand. And so that ends Franklin Roosevelt's involvement with the Quadri-Tyler Power Project. The champion is dead. The original engineers are all dead. And that is the end of chapter 3 of my book. Interested? It continues. The Quadri saga goes on and on through 3 more presidents, and it continues today. So there's power there. Someone will figure out how to do it efficiently, and we hope that they figure it out, because there's much power to be had. So thank you for coming. I'm happy to take questions now or as we wander around. So yes. Yes. At Lorence in France, on the Normandy coast, near Mount Saint-Michel. They have very big tides, 30-foot tides. And in the 60s, they built a tidal electric power plant, and it works. It's been working ever since. It produces the lowest cost electricity in France. It has had negative environmental impacts, particularly sedimentation behind the dam, and reduction in flow and reduction of species diversity. So there are real impacts, but it really does work. Right, so the Huntsman Marine Laboratory was in its early stages, and they did a lot of the fisheries work at that time, and they were on the right ideas. They were on this issue of the circulation and how that would be affected. So they were headed in the right direction. There were a couple of things that didn't make sense, but the interesting thing is the debate was not really about, Huntsman viewed it as such, as an environmental issue, but the debate was really about the fishing industry. It was not about the environment as such. And so our view is different from the view at the time. I sometimes say, I think the Quadri-Tidal Power Project was killed for the wrong reasons. That it was killed for politics and money, but I don't think you would do it now the way it was proposed, because I think the impacts would be too big. But you could, if you had done something, we would learn. So there was a question earlier about some of the other things that are going on in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is doing lots of experiments. There's experiments going on in Eastport. But those are all relatively new. Not much happened for a long time. And if something had been done in the 20s or the 30s, we would have learned from that process. And so we would be well advanced. They've had lots of challenges, but it's teeny, teeny, teeny bits of money that are being applied compared to, you know, the nuclear power industry, the traditional fuel-fired industry, et cetera. So. I tracked 8 different versions of the Quaddy project because it kept on changing and morphing. It's actively being considered through the 80s. And then in the 90s, they start to shift to this idea of, instead of building dams, just put little teeny turbines down there. You'll only produce a tiny percentage of the power, but hopefully at a better cost efficiency and with less impact on the environment. So I think that that's the future, is that these niche markets rather than these mass markets. Yeah.
It begs the question, what came first, or who came first? Because the urban legend is that Roosevelt came to Kemperville, saw the prospect of doing this, but that's not the case.
So Dexter Cooper is the guy who drove this. There were other people who had thought about this idea in the past, but nobody had the knowledge, the skill, or the determination to turn that basic idea into something viable. Dexter had the knowledge, the skill, the drive to turn it into something viable. So there, in the book, I profile a number of these people who said, yeah, you could put a dam here. Okay. It's 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. But it really is Dexter Cooper who is the driver. But Franklin is involved from 1919 on. He's involved with the project at some level. So it's Dexter Cooper who's driving it for a while. And then when Franklin becomes president and we're in the crisis of the Depression, that's when Franklin really takes the lead. So. And there are lots of people, one of the things that appeals to me about this story is it's real. It's, everything that's in the book is as real as I can determine it. You know, there are 3,000 footnotes in the book. So I have reason to say what I say. But it's hard to figure that out. And all the characters are really interesting because they're real. The good guys did bad stuff. The bad guys did good stuff. And it's this complex, they're dealing with the issues that we're still dealing with. So, I see you. Question back here, or just, okay. Thank you. Great. Well, I hope you enjoy it. And as I say to everybody, I'm quite sincere about this. Write to me. Tell me what you agree with, what you don't agree with, what you know that I should know, because I'm still interested. The book has been done, but you know, I'd love to see a documentary on this, and I keep looking for information. Yeah. Right. Right. It could be. I think they've got that experiment, right? The activities, particularly in Parsboro, Nova Scotia, where they have built this test facility, and they've, which is a really good idea, but they also put it in the most difficult spot there is. And so when they put these great big turbines in there, 50 feet across, there's so much water moving through there. You know, water is 800 times more dense than air. So, you know, a 6-knot current in the air is like a gentle breeze. You get 6 knots of right. Yeah. It's just roaring through. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah, Eastport. So they're doing things in Eastport, and I'm a believer that they will find technologies that work at a certain scale. And the question is it always a niche market, or can you scale it? And I don't know. Uh-huh. Yep. Right. Uh-huh. Right. 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 One of the other things is that up there in the upper reaches of the Bay of Fundy, whether you're in Chignecto or Minas, that's a lot of sandstone. And that's a lot of suspended sediment, which is just like concrete and just rips things to bits. So if you build further out, you have less of that to deal with. So again, they picked a tough spot to right, exactly. You've got different rocks, so you won't have that issue to deal with. A little less of the sedimentation issue in terms of behind dams and things like that. So, you know, all of these things need to be carefully balanced, and if you work at it, you can find better solutions than we have in the past. So, thank you. So, oh well, it's yeah.